Hello, all my lovely bad ones. It's time for Mary Downing Hahn's All the Lovely Bad Ones, a ghost story. Chapter 5. At the end of Chapter 4, Travis had just walked out to the grove of trees where Corey was pretending to be the ghost, and he felt as if something was watching him or was there with him. In the middle of a bad dream, I woke up to see a hideous face hanging over me. "Wake up, Travis," it moaned. "It's time to go to the grove." "No, no," I pushed the thing away from me, only to hear it laugh. "Fooled you," Corey crowed. "Brat," I muttered, too embarrassed to come up with a clever retort. "It's time for the ghost to walk." Corey glided toward the door. Shoving my blankets aside, I got out of the bed and tiptoed outside behind my fearless sister. As soon as I stepped into the shadows under the trees, I began to shiver, just as I had earlier. The night seemed darker here, colder, spookier. The leaves whispered, the shadows shifted, and changed and formed new shapes. I glanced at Corey, but she didn't appear to notice any of things out of the ordinary. With a giggle, she danced across the grass, waving her arms dramatically, her head thrown back, her filmy nightgown fluttering. Just as she had the previous night, she stopped suddenly, turned toward the inn, and screamed loudly. The echo made it sound as if a dozen ghosts or 100 peacocks were shrieking in answer. With one piercing scream, Corey fled into the shadows, and the two of us raced back to the inn. Again, I sensed someone was close by, but not watching me this time, but following me. Someone silent and swift, darker even than the night. I wanted to look back, just to prove nothing was there, but I didn't dare. Corey usually outran me, but a surge of adrenaline sent me speeding into the inn, well ahead of her. I dove into the bed just before Grandmother poked her head into my room. "Travis," she whispered, "are you awake?" I lay still, eyes tightly closed, breathing deep, regular breaths. She closed my door, and I heard her go to my sister's room. "Corey." No answer. I pictured Corey huddled under the covers, made up to look like a ghost from your worst nightmare, and hoped that Grandmother wouldn't pull the blankets back. Soon, I heard my grandmother return to her room, where she was probably lay awake pondering the noisy peacocks down the road. I snuggled deeper into the bed. Between talking about the hauntings and playing the ghost game, I'd set myself up to imagine I'd been watched in the grove and followed to the inn. As Grandmother said about the Jennings, I was obviously susceptible. Nothing was in the grove. Nothing had followed me. It was ridiculous. I was ridiculous. But what was that noise in the hall? Was someone standing just outside my room, ear pressed to my door? I lay still and listened so hard my ears buzzed. Nothing. No, not nothing. A tiny creak, a flutter in the air, a cold draft across my face, a whisper of sound, almost like a giggle. "Corey, is that you?" I sat up and peered into the darkness. I was alone in my room. Feeling foolish, I lay back down and pulled a blanket over my head. The loudest sound was my heart pounding. I might as well have been 5 years old. In the morning, the guests gathered in the dining room to talk about the screaming ghost. The newcomers were almost too excited to eat the waffles Mrs. Brewster had prepared. After grandmother left the room to take a phone call, Tracy came to our table. "I heard the scream last night," she said. She smoothed her hair back behind her ears and grinned. "Tonight, I'm going to camp out in the grove. I want to see the ghost for myself. You know, up close and personal." Corey and I glanced at each other, frozen for a second. "You better not," I said. "No matter what you think, that ghost is definitely dangerous." "Don't be silly," Tracy laughed. Mrs. Brewster stuck her head out of the kitchen and gestured to the bicycle stable. Tracy turned and noticed Robert holding up his coffee cup. "Excuse me," she muttered to Corey and me. "I better get back to work before the old battle axe fires me." As Tracy fetched coffee for Robert, Corey and I left the inn and settled into a pair of Adirondack chairs at the shady end of the lawn. "Do you think she'll go to the grove tonight?" Corey asked. "If she does, she won't see anything." "What do you mean?" Corey frowned as if she suspected I was about to edge her out of the starring role in the little drama. "We'll be inside," I said, "trying some new tricks." Footsteps, doors opening and shutting, sobs and moans and spooky laughter. We got up and ambled across the lawn, talking about things that we could do with flashlights and strings and sound effects. Without noticing where we were going, we ended up in the grove. Even in the daylight, it was a gloomy place. The shade seemed too dark, the air too cold, too still. Moss grew thick on the damp ground and furred the tree trunks. Toadstools sprouted everywhere, some red, some yellow, some white, all poisonous, I was sure. A crow watched as mournfully from a high branch, but no birds sang. Corey shivered and folded her arms across her chest. "Tracy's a lot braver than me. I wouldn't sleep here by myself. Not if you paid me." "Me either," I said. "Last night, I swear somebody was hiding in here in the shadows, watching us." Corey drew in her breath and hugged herself tighter. "I thought it was just my imagination." We were both whispering as if someone might be listening as well as watching. When the crow called from its perch overhead, we both jumped and then tried to pass it off with a laugh. "Let's go," Corey said. "This place gives me the creeps." We left the grove and wandered through a sunny patch of weedy ground, leaping with grasshoppers and humming bees. Wild thistles grew taller than our heads. A narrow path led toward a dilapidated shed and the remains of a barn. Its roof fallen in and its walls collapsed. Vines and brambles crawled and curled over the weathered wood, prying the boards apart. Corey stopped suddenly and pointed at a row of small square stones, barely visible among the weeds. "What are those?" We knelt down to take a closer look. A 2-digit number had been chiseled into each stone, but years of rain and snow made them almost illegible. "They must mean something," I said. "But what?" I shook my head, puzzled. Losing interest, Corey pushed her hair back from her face. "It's boiling hot. Let's go swimming." She headed toward the inn, but instead of following her, I stood there, contemplating the rows of stones. 41, I read. 42, 43, 44. My eyes moved from stone to stone. There were 12 of them, and many more in other rows, all numbered. "Travis," Corey yelled, "are you coming?" Suddenly aware of the heat and gnats buzzing around me, I ran to catch up with my sister. I wonder what they found. Corey and I spent the rest of the morning in the pool, then got dressed and went to the dining room for lunch. Robert and Tim had checked out that morning. to explore New Hampshire's White Mountains. Mr. Nelson was gone too, claiming he had no desire to experience any more supernatural manifestations. The Jennings gang was still there, along with a new couple from Albany who had already been drawn into the ghost conversation. Just as I took a bite of my hamburger, another newcomer swept into the room. Short and plump, with a head of frizzy blonde curls, she wore layers of dark gauzy clothes that seemed to float in the air around her. Her arms clanked with silver and copper bracelets. She sported a ring on each of her chubby fingers, as well as a few on her round little toes, and a small silver hoop on one nostril. Earrings dangled to her shoulders in showers of stars. Her scarlet lipstick matched her nail polish. She'd taken care to coat her eyelids green and spike her lashes with mascara. With much twittering, she joined the group at the Jennings' table. "Don't stare," Grandmother whispered. "Who is she?" Rude or not, neither Corey or I could take our eyes off the woman. "Miss Eleanor Duval," Grandmother said with a sniff. "A self-proclaimed ghost hunter." "Really?" Grandmother tapped Corey's wrist. "Eat your hamburger and stop looking at her. I'm sure she loves your attention." Despite Grandmother's injunction, Corey and I watched Miss Duval as if she had hypnotized us. By the time we'd finished eating, Grandmother was thoroughly annoyed with both of us. "You're from New York," she said. "You must see people like her every day." We shook our heads. Even in the East Village, Miss Duval would have stood out in a crowd. "Oh no," Grandmother muttered. "She's coming this way." Indeed she was, followed by the Jenningses and all of their friends. "Don't talk to her about your so-called ghost sightings," Grandmother warned Corey, "or we'll never get rid of her." "I'm Edna Frothingham," one of the newcomers said, "and this is Miss Eleanor Duval, the world-famous psychic and ghost hunter. I called her as soon as I had heard from the Jenningses." Miss Duval bared a mouthful of tiny teeth in a smile aimed at Corey. "You're the little girl that sees the ghost?" she proclaimed, jingling her bracelets like a musical accompaniment. Just then the phone rang, forcing Grandmother to excuse herself. "Not a word," she hissed in Corey's ear. But of course, Corey couldn't resist the chance to take center stage. "Yes," she said modestly. "I see ghosts all the time." "Lovely." Miss Duval sat down in Grandmother's chair. The others gathered around the table, hanging on every word with their new leader uttered. Corey told her about the Granny ghost, the ghost of the haunted grove, and the other presences she felt in the inn. The crying baby she heard late at night, the footsteps in the hall outside her door, the sobs, moans, and spooky laughter, the howling dog, and so on. There was no end to her imaginings. Obviously enjoying herself, my sister had everyone's total attention. Even Tracy drew near, clutching a tray to her chest, her eyes wide and her mouth half open. You are truly gifted," Miss Duval whispered to Corey. To the others she said, "Often it's children who are most in touch with the spirit world. It's to be expected. After all, they are closer to the other side than we. As the great poet William Wordsworth said, 'Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. Heaven lies about us in our infancy.'" The Jennings gang nodded solemnly, as if they all knew Wordsworth by heart and understood exactly what Miss Duval meant, which was more than I could say for myself. "When I first spoke to Corey, I knew she was special," Mrs. Jennings said, taking the role of my sister's discoverer. Miss Duval turned to me. "And how about you, Travis? Do you share your sister's powers?" Taken by surprise, I said, "Sometimes I sense things, like the grove. It's, it's, I can't explain it, but the grove, yes." Miss Duval rose from the table in a whirl of gauze and a tinkle of jewelry. "Take me there. I must see it." With some reluctance, Corey and I led the whole group of adults across the lawn and into the grove. The woman from Albany made the sign of the cross, and her husband mumbled a prayer. Mrs. Jennings said she felt faint and took her husband's arm. Her friends gathered closely about Mrs. Duval. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" Miss Frothingham said. Eyes closed, Mrs. Duval swayed as if she'd fallen into a trance. With arms stretched out, she turned in a slow circle, breathing heavily. "Come forth," she whispered. "Show yourself, spirit of darkness. I fear you not." She stood still and waited. Nothing happened. Nothing that we could see or hear, that is. But something was there. Something that sent shivers racing up and down my spine, prickled my scalp. Corey actually reached for my hand and held it tightly. Something she would not normally do. Opening her eyes at last, Miss Duval stared at us, the dim lights silvering her hair. "It is here," she whispered, "just as the child said. But it does not wish to reveal itself. Perhaps there are too many of us." With a nervous gesture, she smoothed her clothing and took Corey's other hand. "Come," she said. "We'll return tomorrow when Chester arrives." "Chester?" I asked. "Chester Coakley, my associate," Miss Duval explained. "He was delayed by a nasty piece of business in Salem, but should arrive tomorrow with our equipment." Once we left the grove, the guests began babbling away about the presents in the trees. If Corey and I hadn't felt the thing ourselves, we would have had a good laugh at their expense. That night, Corey and I made plans for some new tricks. Well after midnight, we tiptoed out of Grandmother's apartment, through the silent kitchen, and into the hall. Scarcely breathing, we crept up the stairs. Moonlight streamed through the tall window on the landing. "Look, there's Tracy," Corey pointed outside. We watched the girl cross the lawn, lighting her way with a flashlight. After she vanished into the grove's shadows, we lingered for a moment, watching her light appear and disappear among the trees. "Just like Nancy Drew," Corey whispered. "Don't go to the grove, Nancy," I intoned in a spooky voice. "Don't open that door. Don't go down the steps. Stay out of the attic. Watch your—" "Shut up!" Corey hustled me up the stairs. At the top, we paused and listened. Except for a chorus of snores, all was silent. The guest doors were closed. No lights showed. At the opposite end of the hall were the back stairs, our escape route to the kitchen. We looked at each other and I nodded. Corey began to sob in a high, breathless voice, and I waved a tiny pocket flashlight. Its faint blue light barely lit the darkness. Under our bare feet, the floorboards squeaked and cracked. I tapped at one door, then another, and laughed a horrible laugh. As the guests began shouting and stumbling about in their rooms, we ran silently down the stairs and hid under the kitchen table. Upstairs, Miss Duval screeched joyfully. Sobs, rappings, laughter, footsteps, a blue light. A classic visitation. Grandmother opened the door of her apartment and stepped into the kitchen. From our hiding place, Corey and I watched her bare feet pad past. As soon as she headed upstairs to quiet the guests, my sister and I scurried back to our rooms and jumped into bed. We'd done it again. I would have laughed out loud if Tracy hadn't screamed somewhere outside in the dark. By the time Corey and I reached the front door, Grandmother and the guests had gathered around Tracy. "What's wrong?" Grandmother asked. "What were you doing outside at this time of night? I promised your mother I'd make sure you behaved." "I went to the grove," Tracy sobbed, "to see the ghost. And oh, Mrs. Donovan, it... She collapsed into my grandmother's arms, weeping. "We heard the ghost too," Miss Duval put in, her voice rising. "It was roaming in the hall, sobbing and moaning." "There was a blue light," Mrs. Bennet added. "Blue," her husband said. "Very dim, spectral." "It pounded on our door," Mr. Jennings said. "It laughed like a maniac." "There must be two ghosts," Mrs. Jennings said. "One outside and one inside." "Maybe more," Mrs. Frothingham whispered. Finally, Miss Duval turned to Tracy, who was still crying in my grandmother's arms. "What did you see?" "I didn't see anything, but something was there. I felt it. It was cold and horrible, evil." She clung to Grandmother and cried harder. Corey and I stared at each other. We could explain the inside ghost, but the outside ghost was beginning to frighten both of us. Keeping one arm around Tracy, Grandmother said, "I think it's all time we went to bed and got some sleep. Tomorrow I'll ask Martha what she put in her tomato sauce. It must have been pretty potent." If Grandmother had hoped for a laugh, she was disappointed. "Don't blame the food," Miss Duval said. "This inn is haunted. Just wait till Chester sets up his equipment tomorrow, then you'll see." With that, she flounced upstairs, her gaudy silk robe and her nightgown fluttering, her bare feet seemingly too tiny to bear her weight. Even without jewelry and makeup, she was an amazing sight. The other guests followed her, murmuring to each other about the sobs and laughter, the blue light, and the terrifying presence in the haunted grove. Flashlight in hand, Grandmother led Tracy back to her room in the carriage house. Corey and I went to bed. For once, we didn't feel like talking about the ghost of Fox Hill, or even thinking about them. See you next time, Cougars. Bye, my love.